Hello, Dinuba Presbyterian Church, and welcome back to our study on the chaotic world of the first century, how Jesus responded to that chaos, and what it means for us in our 21st century world. This is the last study in this series, so thank you for watching and for engaging with this study and for sticking with it. And I'm really grateful to be studying God's Word with you. Now, for the last month, we've been looking at different factions within the Jewish community of the first century and how they responded to the problem of Roman rule. These disagreements were causing a lot of chaos, and they were putting a lot of pressure onto the society of the Jews in the time that Jesus lived and the time that he taught and performed miracles. He was arrested and tried and crucified and rose again. It's a complex and fascinating backdrop to Jesus' ministry, and it breathes new life into the words that are recorded in the Gospels that we read. So, the world of Jesus was drowning in conflict, and as we've seen, a lot of that conflict centered on the temple. Pompey had left the temple standing when he conquered Jerusalem, but a succession of Roman rulers had tried to install imperial symbols in the temple, or rob from its treasury. The elite Sadducean priesthood in the temple favored collaborating with Rome, while the temple's sword-wielding zealots favored violent insurrection against Rome to rid them from the land. Jesus had enraged the religious establishment in Jerusalem when he prophesied that the temple would be destroyed and that he would rebuild it in 3 days. There was a lot of talk about the temple in the time of Jesus, and yet the temple was not very long for this world in his time. He alludes to this actually in John 4 when he speaks with the Samaritan woman. The Samaritan woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things." Jesus said to her, "I who speak to you am he." So the Samaritans had their own rival site of worship apart from Jerusalem on Mount Gerizim, and they had even built their own temple, which the Jews had destroyed a couple of hundred years before Jesus was born. Both groups believed that in order to worship God, you had to be in the right place on earth. But they disagreed about where that place was. They disagreed about the right spot for worship. But as we've seen within the Jewish community, the Pharisees were already moving away from temple-centric worship and faithfulness, as were the Essenes, who were, of course, going out into the wilderness. But the Sadducees and the Zealots were both very committed to maintaining the temple system of worship, the former for their own political power, and the latter out of very fiery religious fervor. The arrival of Jesus on the scene in the first century forever changed how humanity relates to God. The age of the temple was ending. Worship is no longer a matter of a right place. It's a matter of a right heart. And this era, as the temple is coming to a close, really sees all four of these groups that we've been studying careening toward a final conflict with Rome. And hopefully this epilogue that we're doing this week sheds some helpful light on the movement of God in a supremely chaotic time in history. So the central point of friction between the Roman Empire and the Jews was, of course, over religion. The Romans had inherited a polytheistic pantheon of gods from the Greeks, and along with all of that varied mythology. This polytheistic belief could be expanded to include newly invented or newly discovered gods, and the cult of the Roman emperor himself began to grow a little less than 50 years before Jesus was born, after Pompey had conquered Jerusalem. The known world was being brought under Rome's rule more and more, and subsequently the world that had seen a lot of warfare was becoming more peaceful as Rome grew. Fewer and fewer enemies could withstand the empire. A world that had been besieged was beginning to see a new era of peace, even though it's peace under Roman rule, starting to dawn. This is called the Pax Romana. It was all thanks to the Caesars, people believed. And the major economic benefits for subdued regions made the people actually really grateful. And so temples began to be built to Caesar, to Julius Caesar, and to his son Augustus, celebrating what they had done. And eventually this developed into a cult that believed that the emperor was divine, that he was a divine being, that he was a god. This is one of the sharpest points of pressure that's being exerted on the Jewish people during Jesus' life on earth and in the decades immediately after. Judea had never really experienced the so-called peace of the Romans, and the Jewish people maintained their identity as monotheists, exclusive worshipers of the one true God, the only one to whom they would give their allegiance and their devotion. The unique belief of the Jews was incompatible with the world being consumed by Roman polytheism and the imperial cult. Not surprisingly, conflicts intensified in Judea, not only between the Jewish people as a whole and the Romans, but also within the Jewish community itself, as the four groups that we've been studying reacted to increasing Roman pressure. Divisions between the Sadducees and the Pharisees became more violent. And as we've already seen in the book of Acts, there was a moment in the Sanhedrin when Paul is before them that just devolves into an all-out brawl that almost killed Paul before he was pulled out of there, just because Paul had mentioned the resurrection. The Zealots continued to increase in popularity after the years of Jesus' ministry on earth, and also in political organization. And they began gaining seats in the Sanhedrin that were being lost by the Sadducees. The last Roman procurator of Judea, a man named Gessius Florus, struck a deal with the Zealots when he took power in 64 AD. He would not interfere with the Zealots, and in fact, he would provide support to the Zealots if they gave him a percentage of everything that they plundered and stole in their robberies. The frequency of Zealot attacks on villages and cities greatly increased during his short reign, and this was becoming unbearable for the people. So 2 years later, in 66 AD, the Jewish people revolted against Rome en masse, and the conflict that historians call the First Jewish-Roman War began. The war was initially a back-and-forth affair. The Romans would win victories and slaughter thousands of the Jewish people in their cities, only to be repulsed by a Jewish counterattack and emboldened, and the Jews were, of course, emboldened, I should say, by somewhat incompetent Roman leadership. Soon after the war started, Emperor Nero was looking for a new military commander to prosecute it on his behalf, and he turned to Titus Flavius Vespasian. Vespasian had already been a general officer for some number of years in the Roman army and had seen success in campaigns spanning from what's modern Germany and Great Britain and also Northern Africa. He was a calculating and sometimes hesitant man, and this was a trait that would serve him well in the fog of war and in the chaos of imperial politics. He had recently fallen out of Nero's good graces, probably because he dared to fall asleep during one of Nero's marathon amateur violin concerts. He just couldn't stay awake, and Nero was really, really unhappy about it. But this new commission in Judea was his chance to restore his political fortunes and his standing among the imperial elite. According to the historian Josephus, who was a Jew who was captured by the Romans during this war, Nero trusted Vespasian to accomplish this task in part because of Vespasian's two sons. His eldest son, Titus, was an able military commander and went with Vespasian to the war as his second in command. His youngest son, Domitian, was just 15 years old at the time when the war began, or when Vespasian was assigned to the war, which meant that he was going to stay in Rome, which meant that Nero could easily hold Domitian hostage if he thought Vespasian was acting against him. Now, people were acting against Nero, but Vespasian wasn't really involved, but Nero didn't know that yet. Upon arriving in Judea, Vespasian found himself in charge of an army made up of 3 Roman legions and regional forces from the surrounding provinces. In total, he had a force of 60,000 men and several hundred horses. Vespasian's insight and his caution kicked in. He realized that this gigantic army gave him immense political power if he used it intelligently. He decided to slow walk the conflict, drawing out his campaign for several years from the year 66 into the year 69, when the capital city of Rome was consumed by a catastrophic political crisis. That conspiracy that I was alluding to before against Nero resulted in Nero's suicide in 68. As soon as Nero was dead, the governor of Spain declared himself the next Roman emperor. His name was Galba, and he was already 70 years old, so there was pressure put on him to appoint his successor before he died of old age. He did appoint a successor at the very beginning of 69, but he did not appoint his most loyal supporter, a man named Otho. Otho was enraged, and Otho's followers were enraged, and so Otho had the Praetorian Guard assassinate Galba, and Otho was proclaimed as emperor. At the same time, Vitellius, the governor of Lower Germany, declares that he is emperor too. And so he takes his army and he marches to Rome. He defeats Otho's army and becomes emperor. Now, when this happens, several governors in the western part of the empire declare Vespasian to be emperor, and it's only been about 7 months in which all of this is happening. We're only about halfway through the year 69. So Vespasian was very, very smart. He used this huge military force that he commanded that's parked in Judea to disrupt the shipment of grain from Egypt into Rome, putting economic pressure on them. He rallied some more army, went to Rome, conquered Vitellius, killed him, threw his body into the Tiber River, and was crowned emperor at the end of 69. This is what we call the year of 4 emperors. So Vespasian's patience had been rewarded with the imperial throne, but his decision to move slowly also exploited divisions among these factions of the Jewish people that we've been studying over the past month. It induced panic amongst the Sadducees, who could see the writing on the wall as early as 67 AD, as Vespasian's forces slowly advanced, cutting off Jerusalem in all directions. Defeat was inevitable. They urged the zealot majority to surrender to Vespasian and save as many Jewish lives as they could. But the thought of surrendering to the Gentiles was abhorrent to the zealots, and they refused. And in 68, they began killing the Sadducees who were advocating for peace and hanging their bodies publicly as a warning to the people. When the Romans began the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the zealots were looking for a way to convince the people not to wait out the siege, but to join with the zealots for one final climactic battle against the Roman army. To get their point across, the zealots burned the food stores that had been set up by the Pharisees and the Sadducees to feed the city while the Romans were cutting it off. The people could fight, or they could starve. Not enough people came around to the zealots' point of view, and the Roman siege dragged on for 7 months while the people died of hunger. Anyone trying to escape the disaster in Jerusalem was caught by the Romans and crucified. So after these 7 months, Titus's army breached the walls of the city, they invaded the temple, and then they did what Pompey had chosen not to do 140 years before. They set the temple on fire, and they destroyed it. To this day, almost 2,000 years later, it has never been rebuilt. The gold inlays inside the temple had melted and flowed into the gaps in between stones. Titus ordered that the stones be split apart to recover the gold and send it back to Rome. And this fulfills Jesus' prophecy that not one stone would be left upon another when the temple was destroyed. All that remains of that temple today is a western retaining wall, now called the Wailing Wall, where devout Jews go to pray. Josephus, the ancient historian, said that 1 million Jews died in this siege, and 70,000 were sent to Rome as slaves. Vespasian and Titus used many of those slaves to build the famous Roman Colosseum, the site of deadly games and circuses that would take the lives of both Jewish zealots, and Christian martyrs. And thus the curtain kind of comes down on this chaotic time around the lifetime of Jesus. So what became of these four groups that we've been looking at? Well, the Sadducees were wiped out. The rise of the Zealots was the beginning of the end for their political power, and between their slaughter at the hands of the Zealots and the Romans, and the destruction of their seat of power in the temple, they just simply ceased to exist. The Zealots fell victim to the process that Jesus warned about when Peter drew his sword in the Garden of Gethsemane. Having taken up the sword, they died by the sword as Vespasian and Titus crushed the rebellion. Within another 100 years or so, the Zealots were completely wiped out too. The Essenes were scattered and likely suffered a great deal of death as the Romans prosecuted the war. We know them now only through the scholarship that they left behind, safe and secret in their caves until they were discovered. We know also that there are remnants of the Essenes' kind of mystical bent and communal lifestyle in modern Essene movements like the Tree of Life Foundation, and also Kabbalah, a form of Jewish mysticism, is descended from the Essenes' point of view, and Kabbalah enjoyed a lot of popularity among very elite Hollywood types several years ago. The only group of these four that survived the cataclysmic events of 70 AD, amazingly, was the Pharisees. Their commitment to democratizing Judaism, starting synagogues around the Greek-speaking world, and creating ways for the Jewish people far away from Jerusalem to study and practice their faith, all of this that they had done prepared them for the sudden, violent transition into religious life without a temple. They were the founders of what we call Rabbinical Judaism, that is, Judaism after the destruction of the temple in 70. Those practicing Judaism today around the world are descendants of a Pharisaical philosophy, and that movement has preserved Judaism for 2,000 years in a world that's often very hostile to it. But there's a fifth group that we've been studying all this time, and that's the Roman Empire. Its hostility toward Judaism included hostility toward Christianity. Vespasian's younger son, Domitian, when he became emperor, ignited the first great state persecution of the Christian church in the empire. And it's probably during Domitian's reign that John was exiled to an island and wrote the book of Revelation. These persecutions continued for over 200 years and ended when Constantine came to power and issued the Edict of Toleration in 313 AD, making Christianity legal in the Roman Empire. Tolerance turned to conversion, and Christianity became eventually the official state religion. Today, the Roman Church is the single largest denomination of Christians in the world, accounting, they say, for about 1 billion people. And vestiges of the ancient Roman Empire can be seen in its dress, in its terminology, in its governance, and also in its language of Latin. While we in the Protestant tradition have significant and important disagreements theologically with the Roman Catholic Church, its existence is a proof of the power of God in history to subvert the evil empires that cause chaos and death and turn them inside out to accomplish his purposes in the world. Jesus wasn't surprised by the chaos that he saw in the first century or by the events of 70 AD. Jesus wasn't surprised by the world wars of the 20th century or by the COVID-19 pandemic that we're experiencing now. Jesus knew that the world would be full of chaos. When our instinct is to separate ourselves from that world, Jesus has taught us to reach out. When our instinct is to put our faith in temporal human politics, Jesus teaches us to view the world from an eternal perspective and place our faith in him. When our instinct is to change the world through violence, Jesus teaches us to be at peace and to love. And before he was arrested and crucified, Jesus prayed for us. He prayed for you and for me, for the generations that would come after his disciples, as John records in his gospel. Jesus prays, "But now I am coming to you," that is, to the Father. "And these things I speak in the world, that they may have my joy fulfilled in themselves. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from evil. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Set them apart in the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And for their sake I set myself apart, meaning as a sacrifice, that they also may be set apart in truth. I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they will all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they may also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you have given me, I have given to them, that they may be one, even as we are one, I in them and you in me, and that they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them, even as you loved me. In the midst of a chaotic world, Jesus prayed for me and for you, and continues to advocate for us to the Father in heaven. Down through the ages and in our time, Jesus' church exists to show the world something different, to show the world another way than the way of chaos. It is a way of peace, a way of calm assuredness of God's love and care despite the storms of history. The way of Jesus is the way to the Father, and that way is always open, no matter what might be happening in our world. Thank you again for joining us for this study. Next week, we're going to be starting a new series about great prayers of the faith, both of those recorded in the Bible and some from Christian history that can help to strengthen and shape our own faith. So I'm really excited about that series. It starts next week. I hope you'll join us for that. Until then, this week, may God bless you, and we'll see you next time.